Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
You know, I get the chance to speak after John Greendeer. Reminds me of the first time I ever gave a talk on a national level. I was representing the state of Wisconsin as head of DNR at at that time it was called the International Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and I was the first speaker after the keynote speaker. We were in New York, and the then governor of the state of New York gave their introduction, and I had the misfortune to follow him. It was Mario Como, if any of you remember him, and the excellent orator he was. I thought, oh wow. And I did not match it. I hope I can match John's excellent talk, and I can tell you I agree very much with just everything John said. I think he really laid out a good perspective of how the challenges we're facing and how we need to work together to face them. When Dave called, he asked me to talk about three things, and if you saw the poster, I'll do that. Basically, the things I've been asked to talk about is how budget cuts have weakened the DNR, the politicization of the Department of Natural Resources, and then the role of citizens to strengthen conservation in Wisconsin. And before I go into that, it's always important for an audience to know where the speaker is coming from, and I think you could tell that from John very quickly. And many of you may know me or whatever, but let me tell you the perspective I do bring to this. In terms of, I'm speaking today as Executive Director of the Wisconsin Wildlife Federation. The things you will hear also represent my personal opinion on issues. There's, I think, a pretty good alignment between the two. I would not be working for the organization. But they're you. They're just like you. The Wisconsin Wildlife Federation is made up of 195 hunting, fishing, trapping groups in the state of Wisconsin, recreational users throughout the state, average citizens. They're dedicated volunteers. Besides those organizations, we have 6,000 individual members. Many of them don't hunt, fish, or trap, but there's all the common interest in fish and wildlife in the state and their habitat, our air, our land, and our water. And on that level, no matter what their perspectives are, whether they hunt or don't, there's a common bond. It's the grandmother, as John said. That's the common bond. And like you, they put a lot of effort into their interest in protecting the land, the air, the water, and the fish and wildlife. Our organization, it's a statewide organization. You heard the size of the membership. There's only 2 employees. A business manager who really runs the fiscal aspect of the organization, critical, and myself. And the rest is done by volunteers. I have a 57-member board of directors, and it's very workable. We have bi-monthly meetings that last 8 hours, and we have an executive committee in between. We have committees that work. It works smooth as a clock. They've been doing it since 1949, and it works very, very well. And they work. My board is active, and that's why we can have the impact we do have. They go to public hearings. They stop at town hall meetings when their U.S. senator or congressman are there, and they talk to them about the issues. And we have a dual mission, which is conservation education, a number of youth programs, and that's about 80% of our focus is that, but then the one that's most visible is advocacy for strong conservation laws and red policies in the country and the state. Myself, I think most of you know me from my days in DNR. Started, actually I just passed my 46th year of working in conservation. I started in 1970, retired, taught in 2002, taught for a couple of years at Lawrence University, and then joined The Wisconsin Wildlife Federation is their first executive director. And what I'm going to talk about today, you see the message, what the current state of the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources is. It's actually broader than that because it's the executive and legislative branches of government I'll be getting into and what that means in terms of the current state of conservation in the state. And then most importantly, and probably the most importantly, as you'll see, in terms of that state of conservation is the need for even stronger citizen involvement in conservation. Now, speaking to the right people, one reason and probably the most important reason I eagerly agreed to speak when Dave was here is to say a simple 2 words: thank you. Thank you to you for all you do as individuals and as organizations to promote and ensure there's strong conservation in the state of Wisconsin. And I can end my speech there because that is really the message and the moral of this whole talk. Well, let me go ahead. As I indicated, I've been working on this for 46 years. And well, let me start with this premise before I go to the next slide. 46 years ago, I started DNR. I worked there 32 years. A couple of my colleagues, Joe Ansel and Al O'Leary, I was thinking of Phil O'Leary. Get my O'Learys mixed up, are here today. And I want to make something very certain. When I talk about the DNR and the difficulties in DNR, I'm not talking about the rank and file. They're outstanding professionals who are trying to do a very good job and do so to the extent they can. That's not the difficulty we have. But I can tell you things are totally different. Before I worked there, the shoulders we stood on as employees of DNR from the strong people that worked there before we were there and during the time we were there and for a short period after, citizens could actively rely that the Department of Natural Resources had their back when it came to protecting natural resources. And whether they were hated or loved, and both of those applied, depending who you talked to or which bar you were in or cafe and whatever small town in northern Wisconsin. People had a lot of confidence that, okay, DNR will make sure it works out okay when it came to conservation environmental issues. A very high level of confidence in the agency, regardless of whether they liked them or didn't like them. And part of the apathy we still face today, as John referred to some of the apathy, is there's people that still think that's the case. But it isn't the case anymore. There's been a dramatic change in how our state agency and those that have the responsibility to fund them and to ensure their strong policies are doing in terms of that mission of protection of Wisconsin's environment. Government is no longer the backstop to protect the environment in the state of Wisconsin. It's the citizens of the state, you, and people like you throughout the state that are really the backstop to protect our natural resources in this state. And that's why you're all doing really hard work. We got to work harder and get more people involved to do it. Now on with the slideshow. Everybody has to have a philosophy in life. Why do I still want to do this? Why are you involved in this? Here's my philosophy of life. Live each day like someone left the gate open. Follow that and you'll go far. Let me start with the issue of budget reductions. And I'm just going to do the last budget. The one before it was equally as bad. And this is what hamstrings the agency, hamstrings the employees and agency from being able to carry out the responsibility. It's part of it. I was secretary from 93 to 2001. In 1995, to where we are today, the DNR has been cut 600 positions. Currently, their authorized level is 2,600. They have 2,300. The authorized level when I was secretary was 3,300. That's almost a 20% reduction in the agency. Think about that, 1995. There wasn't a frac sand mine in the state. There were some older, larger operations, but only a handful. I think when I was secretary, there were about 3 CAFOs in the state. At the end, 1995 may have only been 1. Just in the last budget, 93 positions were cut from the state agency. 59 of them were either fish managers, wildlife managers, conservation wardens, and research scientists. These are frontline positions that are out there managing the resources, enforcing the laws, being the eyes and ears of what's happening out across the state. Let me go on with the research scientist. We had a nationally known Bureau of Research in our Department of Natural Resources. Cutting edge research being done to both manage our air, land, and water in terms of water quality, air quality, cleaning up landfills, to our fish and wildlife management, our forestry management of the state. 18 of our 35 research scientist positions were cut. 1/2 of the research. Will that affect us dramatically today? No, it will in 5 years though, because you won't have that science available to do the management of the resource. And in fact, in making the professional judgments, this is what the active managers needed. What's going to happen if we do this? These are the folks that answered those questions. You lose that database, you lose that information, and your management becomes a lot more guesswork than science. State park program. This is a grand experiment we're doing in the state right now. $5 million of taxpayer money, which was 25% of the park's budget, was cut. Now, part of that, about 1.4 million, was backfilled with that 5 million was backfilled by going to fee increases, and they just kicked in this year. And the question is, and this is really, every time this has been tried nationally, it has failed. The last was the state of Washington to fully fund the state park system with just user fees. Washington did it about 5 years ago. They had to sell off properties, and they've gone back to state tax subsidies for their park system. Our park system had a little bit of a revenue surplus because they had a good year a couple of years ago. But if they get into a bad weather year, and that's what drives our park attendance, it's whether it rains on weekends. It's that simple. They don't have, 2 or 3 years worth of reserves. If they do that, this grand experiment will fail. I always thought it was important for the Department of Natural Resources to educate people about natural resources, especially our youth. Well, all 11 educators in the Department of Natural Resources were removed, positions removed by the legislature. And besides, they were out talking to students, they did some of that, but they were teaching the teachers. They're the people that, in fact, would have seminars for all the classroom teachers or naturalists, who then went in and multiplied tens of thousands of young people every year across the state. They're gone. And what is really troubling to me as a former secretary of the agency, at a staff meeting, the secretary of the agency said to staff, not to her close confidants, but to her staff, why do we need educators in the Department of Natural Resources? Why do we need research scientists in the Department of Natural Resources? It's on film. Other changes. In this state, we have shoreline zoning regulations. They were put in place in 1970. I can remember I was there in the legal staff when they were still working on them. They're minimum standards. They are the minimum statewide. They apply from Lake Geneva, the busy lakes of south and highly developed lakes of southeast Wisconsin, to the wilderness lakes of northern Wisconsin. They were set to provide a base, largely based on the very heavily developed. They are protective of trying to prevent damage to the more wilderness lakes. So about 8 years ago, the legislature, Republican legislature at the time, passed authority to the local counties to be able to come up with enhanced shoreline zoning standards to fit their lakes. So many of the counties, about 30 counties, had 2 or 3 years of public participation with the lakeshore owners and citizens to come up with varying standards to maybe have higher standards for the higher quality lakes. But we've had a highly developed, they maybe stay at the minimum standards. Very good public process. None of them got challenged in court. Citizens were happy. Senator Tom Tiffany and Representative Adam Jarko thought, wait a minute, that is taking away property rights. So in the state budget, without public hearings, they eliminated 30 counties' enhanced shoreline zoning ordinances without even a public input.
Ooh.
Now, look at the northern county boards in northern Wisconsin. These are pretty conservative people serving on those boards. They got wiped out. These folks knew what was best for their county, best for tourism, best for their economic development. But a couple of legislators thought they knew more. Recycling grants to local governments was cut by 22%, $4 million. One of our major problems, and you heard it earlier, is phosphorus in our waterways. Nitrogen. We need a lot more money. Wildlife Federation has testified before the Natural Resources Board for the last 3 or 4 budgets asking for more money for cost sharing for farmers to help keep nutrients on the land and not in the water. Legislature actually cut it by $1.1 million. Who needs environmental education? The legislature didn't think so. They eliminated the Wisconsin Environmental Education Board and its grant program, which was heavily used by teachers across the state and camps, summer camps for youth, use it for some of their programs. One of the things we're going to find out is there had been a requirement, a fairly new requirement, that the DNR would have to have active timber harvest on 66% of the state forest lands. That was raised in the budget to 75%. And to put in context, think of that, there's wetlands and other lands in state forest, obviously developed areas. And the question is, we're going to, and the state foresters are trying to figure out, they have to go to and make sure that there's more of those lands open. And the question is, and I don't know the answer, of whether that is too high a figure or too low. But it didn't come from the Department of Natural Resources foresters. I know that for a fact. Well, we did save some things. The governor had proposed taking away the decision-making authority of the Natural Resources Board and make it an advisory board. Don't ever let them do that. It's one place that any citizen can walk into a meeting and address the 7 people that actually can tell the DNR what to do. I can tell you, our organization uses that opportunity all the time, and we've actually gotten things that way. I'll give an example in a little while. All 7 members of the board, most of them appointed by the governor, said they would not serve on such a board. Why even bother to show up if all you can do is advise someone who's appointed by the governor is going to go ahead and make his or her decision anyway. The governor also was a little bit tricky on how he did this. He didn't zero out the state stewardship fund. He just said he came up with a formula of when it could be used. And according to that formula, it couldn't be used for 13 years. He didn't zero it out, okay? It was a backdoor way of accomplishing the same thing. Thankfully, the Republican legislature put $33 million back into the state stewardship fund. So you can see just in this one budget how the ability of the Department of Natural Resources to do its job was seriously undermined by the legislature and the governor together. Well, let's talk about the politicization of the Department of Natural Resources. In 1995, actually, when I was secretary, the secretary of the Department of Natural Resources became a cabinet position rather than an agency run totally by the board. I was the last, I have the distinction of being the last board-appointed secretary in 1993 and the first governor's appointed secretary in 1995 and then again in 1999. And it was predicted that I fought it. So did Herb Banke, the chairman of the Natural Resources Board. At that time, the governor had also proposed to eliminate the Natural Resources Board. We saved the board, but we lost by 1 vote in the Senate and Assembly on keeping the secretary as a board-appointed secretary. It was a bitter fight. And there was a good chance I was not going to be the first governor's appointed secretary by the time it was done. We were pretty upfront with the governor and with the public on why it was a bad idea. But 1,500 people wrote letters to the governor saying, we didn't like what you did, but at least keep him as secretary. And maybe some of you wrote those letters. And so I continued as the board-appointed secretary for the rest of the governor's term. And I can tell you, because of the sort of that background, and it was not political during that tenure, I was able to keep it from being that way. And because of the public support, I had a power base to be able to push back, and I did not I was not politically affected by the governor, and the governor understood that. But it was very obvious that that was going to change over time. You had a different governor who didn't respect that distance, and you had an agency, a secretary that really depended on the governor and didn't have any own independent power base. It was going to become political, and it has. And it's gotten very political to this stage. And it really depends. If you've got a governor that's fairly good at conservation issues, you'll be okay. That's not too bad. And you got a governor that doesn't believe in those issues, Katie, bar the door. And the door is open.